Hi, this is Lisa from Whitman.
Hi,
this is Mike Farrell from Georgetown.
Mark Garrett from Dartmouth.
And Allison from Haverhill.
John from Bernardston.
Try this again. Okay, there you go. Hello, everyone. This is Carolyn Mecklenburg. I'm the MVP Regional Coordinator from Greater Boston. I'm joined by my colleague, Michelle Rowden, the Regional Coordinator for the Northeast region, and our Program Manager, Kara Runston. We are trying to keep folks muted today because we just want to reduce some feedback noise. If you could submit any questions via the chat function on GoToMeeting, that would be great. And I also wanted to let you all know that we are recording the webinar today so that it can be made available later on.
Please keep yourselves muted if you are not currently. Thank you.
Can folks hear me okay? If you could send a chat message, that would be great.
Okay, great.
Great, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen and the presentation will start. I need to move that file. What's the person? I know I can't. Oh, because it's on the bottom.
Sorry, everybody. One moment.
Here we go.
There we go.
All right, good morning. This is Michelle Rowden. I'm the Northeast Regional Coordinator. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you find this to be helpful as you consider joining the MVP program, or if you are just beginning the planning grant process. As we go through the slides, please feel free to send any questions, as Carolyn said, via the chat function, and we'll answer them at the break, which will be around the midpoint of the slideshow. Here's today's agenda for context. The goal today is to introduce the program to those of you who may not know much about MVP, and for those who are about to start the planning process, give some guidance and direction so that you approach it with the MVP goals in mind and an idea of what climate resilience really means. I am going to take you through the first two bullets on this list about why the MVP program came to be, a bit about climate change in Massachusetts, then we'll take some questions, and then Carolyn will take over from there and go through the Community Resilience Building Workshop, some variations on the process, and the next phase, which is the action grant phase. So the climate is warming, and Massachusetts' current climate reflects that of what was typical of New York or New Jersey. And based on high in red or low in yellow emission standards or scenarios, we can expect our climate to be more like Baltimore or even South Carolina under the, as we call it, business as usual scenario. And just a little bit about the emission scenarios. When we're talking about emissions scenarios, we're talking about the greenhouse gas emissions that are used to predict future climate change. And there are four main scenarios that are used, and they range from the business as usual, which here is in red, whereby we don't do anything to curb our greenhouse gas emissions. And it ranges to a very optimistic scenario where aggressive steps are taken to curb global greenhouse gas. Here are some slides from across the Commonwealth from the past few years, just to show you that climate change is already happening. It has been observed and tracked. Some of the negative effects can be clearly seen, but there are others that are not so clear. So there's a debate about whether this slide, so this slide didn't come out quite the way it's supposed to. but I'll explain what you're supposed to be seeing. So it's an illustration about climate and the effects, and the old debate about whether this is climate or whether this is weather. When we enter a deep freeze, have a blizzard, or cool days in summer, some question whether climate change is even real, and the climate versus weather debate is common. And we like this graphic, which we will try and work on, to help you understand that a warming planet changes our climate and causes negative effects such as heat waves, an increase in extreme storms and nor'easters, ice instead of the typical New England snowstorms, and of course, more rain. So what this is supposed to show you as the coffee in the cup warms up, it evaporates, and then it's the water cycle, basically. More precipitation, ice, and snow results. Oh, there it is. Okay, so now we're going to show you a few impact stories to set the stage. Severe stormwater flooding in Pittsfield. This photo is from the 2011 Hurricane Irene. And this is one of the easily seen effects of climate change. So there was an MVP action grant where the town or a city undertook culvert replacements and utilized green infrastructure. And this action grant came from the priority task list in the planning report and shows the importance of the planning process on the future actions you intend to take. So keep this in mind that when you're going through your planning process, it's very important to list actionable items in your report. And here's an example of a not so easily seen effect of climate change. Climate migrants to Holyoke. After Hurricane Maria, there was an influx of people escaping the conditions in Puerto Rico. Many of them landed in Holyoke. The city did an assessment through an MVP action grant to determine how to better handle an influx of people as storms of such intensity become more frequent. And now I just want to take a few seconds for everyone to consider your own definition of the term resilience. What does it mean to you to be resilient to the effects of climate change? And a little while later, we'll circle around and see if after this presentation, your definition has changed. Temperatures are projected to increase significantly over the next century. Winter average temperatures are likely to increase more compared to the average increase in summer. In terms of public health, we can expect to see an increase in heat-related illnesses and mortality. Urban residents face greater risks of this. It will affect the health of plants, animals, and ecosystems. We may see increased pests. We have already seen changes to the growing season. The growing season is already lengthened by about 2 weeks in the fall and 2 weeks in the spring. In the economic sector, we may see more sick days due to heat-related illnesses, reduced crop production, and impacts to livestock and fisheries. And in terms of infrastructure, there will be larger demands on energy systems, stress on train tracks, roads, and bridges, and other critical infrastructure. And speaking of changes in energy use, heating degree days may decrease, but that also means that cooling degree days will increase. Did I say that wrong? Heating degree days will decrease. And just to give you an explanation, a heating degree day is a measurement designed to quantify the demand for energy needed to heat a building. And a cooling degree day is a measurement designed to quantify the demand of energy needed to cool a building. And so while some might be excited that winters will be warmer and they'll be saving money on their heating bill, it's not necessarily come out in your favor, as you'll likely be needing more energy to cool in the summer. You want to note that Massachusetts, being a temperate, relatively cool northern climate, currently experiences far more time throughout the year that requires heating rather than cooling. And while changes in cooling demand are greater relative to current conditions, They actually represent a smaller anticipated change in absolute energy demand. And as the climate warms, it will increase precipitation in spring and winter months. Also, we will see an increase in consecutive dry days in summer and fall. This increase in total rainfall will result in impacts on the frequency of minor but disruptive flooding events and impact agriculture, forestry, and natural ecosystems. There'll be more intense downpours, and there will be impacts to certain habitats and species with specific physiological requirements, such as northern pines. They rely on cold winters in their life cycle, and they may migrate northward. A reduced snow cover is not good for recreation and tourism, and potential increase in frequency of episodic droughts. We expect a higher occurrence of algal blooms as water temperatures rise and freshwater systems receive more stormwater runoff carrying nutrients. Fish kills and algal blooms can be harmful, preventing recreation and fishing in these areas. This has an impact on communities that rely on the economics of tourism to areas such as lakes and rivers. So all of that was to show you the why MVP was created. So climate change is real, and we would like the communities across the Commonwealth to become more resilient. And this is, we're going to go through the how the MVP program was started. So the Baker-Polito administration has taken a national leadership role on climate change and has instituted important steps for the Commonwealth to lead by example. In 2016, Executive Order 569 mandated an aggressive and integrated effort to using sound science to prepare state government and partner with our local communities to build climate resilience. And in 2018, the Environmental Bond Bill codified the executive order and authorized over $2.4 billion in capital for investments in preparing for climate change, including the MVP program. Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, affectionately known as SHMCAP. This is implemented in two primary ways, through the Resilient MA Action Team, also known as RMAT, the state's interagency implementation team, and through local partnerships via the MVP grant program. The RMAT is a statewide steering committee that guides implementation of the SHMCAP. It is staffed by a designated climate change coordinator from each executive office that ensures that their agencies assigned actions and integration of the plan into their agency's daily work. In its first year, the RMAT will be developing a statewide climate resilience standards and guidance, and to increase the consistency and robustness and climate change resilience review across projects, procurement, and permitting. RMAT will also be piloting a resilient capital planning evaluation tool across the statewide capital budget plan to ensure investments do not increase exposure to climate risk and serve to build resilience across the Commonwealth. We intend to develop these templates for municipalities to use through the MVP program. So while the state prepared its own climate hazard mitigation and plan, we knew it was equally, if not more important for local municipalities to start these conversations about preparing for future climate impacts in their own communities. Enter the MVP program. The need for these types of conversations, planning, and implementation of priority actions to prepare for these impacts is great. So as you can see, there are over 12,000 culverts in Massachusetts that are undersized and or need repair just to meet current climate conditions, let alone the increased precipitation and flooding projections of the future. We also know there are about 300 high hazard dams and 1,100 municipally owned coastal structures that may need to be upgraded to withstand future sea level rise and flooding scenarios. Extreme heat will also be a problem in the future, and some of our more vulnerable populations living in areas with strong urban heat island effect and who may have less access to cooling may be particularly adversely impacted. So these are the types of conversations and assessments of vulnerabilities that the MVP program sparks in communities through the planning process. And then you're able to fund some of these resulting priority actions through the Action Grant program. So going beyond planning to implementation to increase resilience. Graphic that shows the fully staffed MVP program, the regions, and the regional coordinators within. To increase capacity to provide technical assistance with municipal staff on their projects, there are now 6 regional coordinators. We are here to help with every stage of the MVP process. And for those communities that are not yet enrolled, we can help enroll you in the planning grant process and help you refine your priority actions into viable action grant proposals and implement your action grants. Your regional coordinator is your direct point of contact to the program and to connect you to technical assistance throughout the state. So even though we expect the stats on this slide to change very soon, in the past 3 years, over the past 3 years, we have gotten 71% of the Commonwealth to enroll in the program. That's about 249 communities. We've also seen many of these communities take the next step, which is the action grant step, and implement their priority projects to increase the resilience to climate change. And this amounts to over $17 million in planning and action grants so far. Soon we'll be updating this and you'll see the latest grant results. Here's a breakdown of the types of funding that MVP offers. The planning grants are smaller grants, $15,000 to $100,000 per plan. We do increase the funding for expanded scopes. So if you would like to do additional outreach or some translational services or additional listening sessions, that is available. And then the MVP Action Grant is open to all MVP certified communities, and the range is between $25,000 to $2 million per project. Regionally, if you work with another community, you can apply regionally, and the cap for that is $5 million per project. There is a 25% match required, and that can be in kind or cash or a combination. MVP is a community-led process. Local knowledge sharing and collaboration is its cornerstone. We provide funds for each community or regional partnership to conduct its own process with its own diverse set of stakeholders. In the end, you get a plan that is tailored directly to the town and your values and has the local buy-in needed to make it implementable. This is very important. MVP also values using the best available climate data. And in order to do that, we host a clearinghouse called resilientma.org that has downscaled climate data and projections to the county and watershed level. We want everyone to use this data when planning their projects. MVP also focuses on nature-based solutions. You will hear this term a lot in our program. These are actions or strategies that rely on ecological processes to achieve climate resilience objectives like wetlands conservation, low impact design, green instead of gray infrastructure. We also highly value projects that reduce the risk of climate change to environmental justice and vulnerable populations. And we want you to involve these stakeholders directly in the planning and implementation process. So for this, we'll go into this a little bit more later. But we really want you to be creative and think critically about reaching those populations. So the ultimate goal is to mainstream the discussion of climate change and preparing for its impacts into everyday planning in local communities. So you want to move from being reactive to proactive and resilient to the changing conditions. And one other advantage to MVP certification is that we think it looks good when you apply to other state grants. And some of those grants are available through CZM, DEP, DER, MassWorks, and some others. So now I'm going to go back and explain a little bit more about our focus on outreach and engagement. It's very important to the MVP program, especially vulnerable populations. We feel strongly that there should be equity when dealing with the effects of climate change and support efforts to reach these groups and involve them in the planning process. Outreach and engagement are not the same thing. Outreach is a one-way communication, such as a flyer, a slide on the local TV, or a mass email. Engagement is actual public participation. Engagement leads to broader participation and wider community input. So through deliberate, well-planned public engagement, community members become informed about, participate in, and influence public decisions. We urge all communities to go through the process, to think about vulnerable populations in your cities and towns. Who are you trying to reach? Are you trying to reach seniors, low income, environmental justice? What is important to that group of people? What are their priorities? Set up a space so that they feel comfortable and they feel like they're allowed to tell their stories. People like to tell stories, and this can inform the town as to what is important to that particular group. You also want to identify any obstacles to these groups from becoming involved in this process. Working parents might need night or weekend meetings that provide childcare. Do you need to provide translational services at a meeting or for printed materials? Utilize your neighborhood organizations, homeowners associations, faith-based groups, Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, even your book clubs. Think outside the usual board or commission meetings. Set up a table at the farmer's market, Beer Fest, Art Fest, regional sports tournament, and of course, social media. Also, when you're selecting your vendors, choose those that have real experience engaging with EJ or vulnerable populations. You can ask for an engagement plan as part of your bid process. Select vendors that are themselves diverse racially or ethnically. And encourage individuals from EJ organizations and from EJ communities to get trained as MVP vendors. So as an example, in Amherst, a single mother who lived in public housing showed up to the CRB workshop to give her input and realized that her demographic was not being represented. She spoke up, and the town not only decided to expand their outreach, but had another workshop and hired this woman as an outreach consultant to make sure that communities such as hers were heard and their input incorporated into the final report. It did change the outcome of the workshops, resulting in a more comprehensive set of priorities. So, nature-based solutions. I told you you'd hear more about it. They are a key component of the MVP program. This refers to green instead of gray infrastructure, for example, planting trees in urban areas to combat the heat island effect, retrofitting parking lots or other impervious areas by utilizing low-impact design techniques like swales and rain gardens. You see that in the photo. It can also include restoration of resource areas and creation of buffer zones to absorb floodwaters or create windbreaks to curb soil erosion, important to those in the ag industry. It can mean climate-smart agricultural techniques. The population is growing, causing a higher demand for food and water while we're trying to reduce our emissions. This requires some innovation. This innovation is what the MVP program intends to fund. So the two examples listed on the slide are forest management and LID stormwater techniques. Several climate-driven hazards can be addressed by these two nature-based solutions: heat, precipitation, wind, with numerous co-benefits such as aquifer recovery and carbon sequestration. This slide shows pictorially how some of the typical problems faced by cities and towns can be taken care of by some potential nature-based solutions, and also the co-benefits that can result. For example, a town may try to alleviate flood risk through strategic land acquisition. This will mitigate the flooding and may also provide open space for recreation, habitat for wildlife, and increase the value of nearby properties. And now we're going to circle back around to that definition of resilience you've been thinking about. The MVP program aims to help municipalities to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from the negative effects of climate change through adaptation. By going through the planning process, you will come up with a document that is a starting point to taking on projects that will increase the resilience of your community to the effects of climate change. There is another program you may have heard of called the 80 by 50 study, which deals with mitigation and aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Together, mitigation and adaptation brings resilience. So I hope that you have a better idea of what the MVP program is looking for in terms of resilience. And that's the end of my part of the presentation. And we can take any questions that may have popped up.
Yeah, so far we don't have any questions, but please put them in the chat function and we will answer them. But in the interest of time, we'll turn it over to Carolyn and then see what questions pop up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michelle. So now that Michelle has provided a lot of the context and more information about the principles surrounding the MVP program, I will walk you through the logistics of becoming an MVP designated community, as well as some of the other opportunities that our program offers. Here is a concise overview of the MVP program, which, if you may have gathered, consists of two grant programs, the MVP Planning Grant and the MVP Action Grant. While we are focusing on the Planning Grant today, I will be touching upon the Action Grants at the end of this presentation, just to provide a preview of the possibilities available to an MVP designated community. But for now, I'll be reviewing the major components of the MVP planning process. These are the main players that are involved in the MVP process. Our office, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, oversees the program, and as Michelle explained, your MVP regional coordinator is your main connection to EEA. While we provide funds and assistance along with the consultant, the municipality is really at the center, driving this process. The core team are a select group of people that will be more heavily involved throughout the process, and you decide who the members of your core team are. It often consists of other municipal employees, but it can also involve other community-based organizations to represent other groups in your community that might not necessarily be a part of your municipal government structure. So we do encourage this if it's feasible. The core team will meet multiple times throughout the process and will be expected to gather at least once a year after achieving MVP designation to review and update MVP priorities. You can select a consultant from our state-approved vendor list. Each of these consultants have undergone a similar training to what we're doing now in order to become MVP certified. And remember that you don't have to select the first vendor that approaches you. Think about what's important to you about your own MVP process. Consider who would be a good match. You may want to interview a few, look through existing MVP plans to see the final products that each vendor creates, or talk to other municipalities to learn about their experiences with different vendors. So with your core team and your vendor, you'll work together to plan the Community Resilience Building Workshop, otherwise known as the CRB. So that's how I'll refer to it through the rest of the presentation. This is really the cornerstone of the MVP planning process. One of the most important pieces of this process is gathering stakeholders that truly represent the wider community. Together, over the course of either one 8-hour workshop or 2 4-hour workshops, you will discuss climate-related hazards that your municipality has seen and can expect to see in the future. You'll identify vulnerabilities and strengths in your community and develop and prioritize actions that address these vulnerabilities. Your discussions will be organized around infrastructural, environmental, and social features in your municipality. It is important to note that this is not intended to be a comprehensive planning process, but rather the beginning of the climate change conversation in your municipality and to identify some initial priority action items. So the MVP planning process is really a place to start. We also really want to emphasize the importance of gathering stakeholders to include in your MVP process. Michelle touched upon this when thinking about your outreach and engagement strategies, but just to talk about it in context of the CRB workshop specifically, consider inviting those who have influence over certain physical and social aspects of your community, as well as who will be impacted by climate hazards in your municipality. Think about those within the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, those who work at the local, regional, statewide, and even federal scale in your community, stakeholders within municipal government, as well as those not in municipal government, and most importantly, consider if all populations living and working in your community are equitably represented, particularly groups such as environmental justice communities and vulnerable populations, who have been traditionally underrepresented in planning processes. These could also include disability advocate groups, LGBTQ or gender nonconforming advocates, domestic violence prevention advocates, representatives for the unhoused, etc. So before you meet with your consultant, we encourage you to create some sort of stakeholder map or list, just so you can begin connecting with these groups as early as possible to ensure that they're aware of the MVP process and can make arrangements to attend the CRB workshop. I will note that the CRB workshop is not intended to be a public meeting at this point. The public meeting will come later on in your planning process, but it is still important to include a diverse array of representatives of your community at the workshop itself. The structure of the workshop is organized around this risk matrix, on which you will list the features in each of the categories I've discussed: infrastructure, environment, and society. The matrix is designed to encourage the development of action items. You'll list the features on the left, you'll identify their location, consider who owns the feature or has jurisdiction over that feature, whether it's a vulnerability, strength, or both, how it will be impacted by each of the top climate hazards you've identified, and any actions that can be taken to address that impact, its priority level, and whether it is short-term, long-term, or ongoing action. I do want to note that the format of this matrix isn't set in stone. You can certainly rearrange it in a way that makes the most sense to you. At the simplest level, for example, you can use one matrix for each category, one for infrastructure, one for environment, one for society, instead of squeezing them all onto one poster. For example, in the town of Wareham, they decided to create a separate matrix for identifying each feature by category, which you can see on this slide here. And then they identified their top priority features and developed actions related to those. So that's an example as to how other folks got creative with the matrix to make it work for them and how they wanted the discussion at their workshop to flow. So whatever you would like to work out is fine with us, as long as the outcomes of the discussion are still, your priority action items that address climate vulnerabilities across the three main categories. So after the CRB workshop, you will take what you've learned, your priority hazards, vulnerabilities, and action items, and bring them to the public. So now it's your opportunity to receive the public feedback. So conducting effective and widespread community outreach to promote this meeting is really critical. In targeting your outreach, return to your stakeholder map. Is there a group who wasn't represented at the workshop, whether because they couldn't attend or they came to your attention after the workshop? Also consider the outreach and engagement strategies that Michelle discussed earlier. Can you provide childcare or translation for your meeting to reduce those barriers that would otherwise prevent people from attending? You may also want to consider different mediums of engagement to solicit feedback in addition to or even at your meeting, such as posting your draft report online and soliciting public comment that way, or having stations at your meeting at which people can provide written feedback, etc. Finally, once you've gathered your public feedback, you and your consultant will develop a summary of findings report that will summarize your entire MVP process. There is a template that's provided in our contract. It's very simple. All MVP reports are made public, and they can be found at this link that you see on your screen here. These slides will be shared later on, so you can explore links at that time. I encourage you to flip through different reports to see what other communities have done so that you can know what to expect. So as your match requirement for the planning grant, you'll be spending between 120 and 200 hours on the MVP planning process. Here's some quick bullets that encapsulate your role as the main driver here. Note that throughout you'll be asked to submit quarterly progress reports to your MVP regional coordinator so that we can regularly stay in touch. The vendor will also work with you throughout your process. They often provide materials for the workshop, such as base maps, but you can really work out the different roles as you would like, depending on your own resources. So maybe if you have a strong GIS staff person, you can create your own base maps. It's really up to you. Remember that you're the expert on your community. So while every MVP planning process centers around the CRB workshop, there are a few variations that may be appropriate for your community that I'll touch upon here. Michelle kind of hinted at these earlier, but I'll just explain them a little bit more. You can complete the planning process as a region. So this may be particularly effective if you have existing partnerships or you would like to expand your own municipal capacity by combining resources. You'll produce one summary of findings as a region, and you'll each become MVP designated individually. So, you'll do your own individual reporting once the process is complete. You can also request a small amount of additional funds to expand your scope of work to meet the particular needs of your municipality. Some communities have taken advantage of this in order to expand their capacity for outreach. So here you can see a snapshot of from a flyer promoting the City of Medford's public meeting and the resources they provided for residents. Because the processes are so similar, we also offer the opportunity to receive some extra funds to update your hazard mitigation plan simultaneously if your expiration year is coming up, or to create a hazard mitigation plan if you don't have one yet. We have worked closely with MEMA, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, to develop an integrated scope of work for this combined process. So as you can see from the graphic, most of the requirements represented by the circles in the middle are exactly the same. So a core team is established for both processes. Local stakeholders are gathered to weigh in on identifying risks and prioritizing actions in light of those risks. These hazards and risks are mapped, and there's a public engagement process to discuss the results and solicit feedback. Some of the differences between the two programs that require additional work above and beyond our standard MVP process or the standard HMP process are shown in the boxes above and below the central circles. So, for example, the MVP process is focused on the top 4 climate-driven hazards, whereas the HMP process requires that you identify all natural hazards and are characterized in terms of past, present, and future risk. MVP program really emphasizes outreach to vulnerable populations and or environmental justice communities, whereas the HMP process requires inclusion of neighboring communities and other local and regional agencies. The HMP requirements also include some additional data gathering regarding development trends, building counts, and loss estimates, as well as an additional public meeting focusing just on the hazard mitigation planning process. So if you're a community undertaking this combined scope, make sure your vendor gets a copy of the attachment A of your MVP contract. This document outlines all of the requirements of the combined scope to avoid misunderstandings about the expectations of both the MVP and HMP processes. Many consultants have worked on each process separately for many years, so they're very much used to doing it separately. But we're really trying to convey that they can be done as one process to save everyone some resources. If this is your case and you are undergoing a combined process, please feel free to reach out to us and we can help guide you on that. To support you and your vendor as you move through the planning process, EEA offers some online resources for data gathering at resilientma.org, our climate change clearinghouse that Michelle has discussed. I want to distinguish, though, between climate data and climate projections, as you'll be using both in your CRB workshop. Data is observed and shows us what has happened with our climate in the past, right up until the present, and this shows shifting climatic trends. This will be helpful in identifying the hazards that you'll discuss at the CRB workshop itself. Here you can see temperature data from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is another great climate data resource. Projections are based on observed data patterns and are future-oriented. So there are different projections based on different emission scenarios, which Michelle has explained. So here is an image from resilientma.org that shows temperature projections for Hampshire County based on those different scenarios, business as usual and a reduced emission scenario. Finally, for your discussion around the social impacts of climate change, I want to point you to a few data sources that may help you. Of course, you know best who lives in your municipality, but here are some sources that can really help you back that up. Through the Commonwealth's GIS online tool, you can find how many designated environmental justice census block groups are in your municipality. Of course, and the link to that is here on the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Mapper. Of course, this designation does not capture all vulnerable populations throughout the Commonwealth, so you can find additional data on the population, age, race, education, employment, etc. through the U.S. Census Bureau. American Fact Finder, which you see here, is their current platform, but I recently learned they'll be transitioning to another site, which you can find under the U.S. Census Bureau link. It doesn't appear to be fully set up yet, but just in case you open this in a couple months or so, that change may have occurred. The Massachusetts Bureau of Environmental Health also has a website with community-specific health and other social information, which you can access through Resilient MA, but I really wanted to point it out specifically here because it is a particularly helpful resource. So that link leads directly to that page. And finally, your regional planning agencies are a great resource. They are experts on the region and do a lot of data gathering themselves, or at least aggregating of census data and more. So feel free to reach out to them. So now that you have a better sense of what the planning process involves, I want to provide a quick overview of the next step, which is the MVP action process, to give you a more complete picture of the entire MVP program. So right now, we have 13 project categories that are eligible for funding. Please note that this list itself is likely to change before the next round of action grant applications are open, but I still wanted to share it to generally convey the kinds of projects that we're interested in funding. Those in the box were new in 2019, so we don't have a lot of examples of projects to share from these types, but we are interested in seeing municipalities pursue these kinds of projects. As Michelle mentioned, we really value nature-based projects. Here is a map of some of those nature-based solutions that have been done across the Commonwealth so far. But I would definitely like to mention some project types that MVP specifically does not fund. These include maintenance projects, diesel generators, tree removal or trimming, projects that just focus on emergency preparedness, and hard infrastructure installations or upgrades without core MVP component priorities, such as nature-based elements, community education and outreach, etc. We also really like to make sure that projects are future-oriented, so thinking about how to adapt to future climate conditions, which is why something like a maintenance project that does not consider those is not eligible for funding. Here are a few examples of some successful action grant projects. Remember that Michelle has already mentioned the great work done in Pittsfield and Holyoke. Millbury is doing a nature-based project and is installing green infrastructure features such as stormwater planters, fire retention bump outs, rain gardens, and more to manage stormwater in their town center and reduce pollution from flowing into the Blackstone River. Salisbury is doing modeling and some design work to raise access and egress roads and making culvert improvements to increase resilience of the Kings Island neighborhood. So again, those are future-oriented improvements that will accommodate increased precipitation and other flooding. Mattapoisett leveraged MVP funding along with some other grant funds to purchase 120 acres of land that offer critical ecosystem services to protect their coast. So this land is now protected from future development and really improves their coastal resilience. Boston revamped its building design guidelines to encourage developers to plan for 3 feet of sea level rise expected by the end of the century. And if you'd like to explore more MVP Action Grant projects, which we definitely encourage you to do, you can visit our MVP Action Grant project page at this link. You'll see the link to the Action Grant summary slideshow, which provides just one slide that summarizes each project. And then below are links to the different deliverables and reports, designs, etc. that came out of those projects. So in closing, we want to remind you of our MVP regions and their corresponding regional coordinators. We are here for your questions and can offer suggestions or technical assistance at any point in the process, from application through to completion. We're based in the region, so we are happy to meet you in person, attend workshops, site visits, etc. And we're frequently available by email and phone. And now we will take any more questions that you might have. Again, if you could just enter them in the chat box and we'll answer as many as we can here. If we don't get to all of them, we can certainly follow up via email. So our email addresses are provided here.
So the first question that was asked was about access to the slideshow. Yes, it will be available on our website after the webinar. I'm not exactly sure what date, but it will be available. The next question was, once a municipality is completed with the MVP planning portion, can they submit a combined application for the action grants with other MVP communities? Yes, you may. We do allow for regional applications. So the lead, it doesn't have to be an MVP certified community. So the requirement is for the lead community to be MVP certified.
And for those projects, you can apply for up to $5 million in funding for a regional project. For individual projects, it's $2 million is the cap.
And the next question is, do municipalities typically use a vendor to help with action grant apps or just use staff? You do not have to use the certified vendors from the list for your action grant applications. You can use any qualified consultant that you prefer. Or you can use town or city staff as well. It's up to you and your capacity.
Yeah, I think we get varied in terms of who submits the applications. Obviously, the application needs to come from the municipality itself, but definitely municipalities get support from vendors if that's the route they choose to go. Any more questions? Oh, okay, one just came in. Let's see. Okay, a currently we have a regional hazard mitigation plan. We received additional funding to update our hazard mitigation plan. Would we be able to use those funds to create a new regional hazard mitigation plan, or would we branch out and create a new individual HMP? This one sounds like a more complicated situation in terms of hazard mitigation planning and MVP. I think you should follow up with us via email, and we can help you sort out that specific situation that seems sort of unique to your community. But yes, let's definitely follow up on that. Great. Okay. Yeah, and in terms of when the slideshow will be posted, we'll try and post it by tomorrow to our website. But if you have any trouble finding it, just feel free to reach out to us. All right. Once the awards are announced, should we expect providers to reach out to us? I think possibly.
Yeah, they often do.
They might reach out to you, but we will provide the list of certified vendors. So for planning grants, you have to use somebody on the list of certified providers. And we'll be providing those in an administrative next steps email that was mentioned in your notification email. So you will be receiving that within the next week or so, I would say, and then you can feel free to pursue whatever vendor you would like. Do we need to wait for an announcement to get an MVP provider? Good question. I think you can go ahead and scope out the field if you like. We'll give some recommendations for how to pick a vendor in that administrative next steps email. But yeah, we know it's a time crunched process with trying to end the whole planning process by the end of the fiscal year, June 30th. And so we want people to be able to, get the project underway. That being said, we still need to execute contracts before we can get that, totally underway. So we'll try and expedite that as quickly as possible. Any more questions? Oh, okay, one more coming in. Okay, yeah, questions about contacting on the provider list. Yes, so we have tried to cull through that a bit. It's very clunky. There are over 400 people that are certified providers, which shows the popularity of the program. But there are constantly updates to that list in emails. So if you're having trouble with a particular person, we can try and help you find contact information. But yeah, I do understand that that's a constant battle to keep that list updated and accurate. So we're here to help if you need us. Any more questions? And if you do have any questions after this webinar, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be happy to help you find the right answer. Okay, see, we have one more question that just came in. Could you describe the child care component? So that's not a requirement. There's not a requirement for childcare. It's more of a suggestion that you make your public listening session or CRB workshop accessible to all those in your community. And so if it's a possibility to provide childcare at one of those venues, for example, to get more parents to attend, that would be great, and we are in full support of that. We want to make sure that it's really equitable and that all different people from different walks of life in your community can show up and participate in the process. All right, so I think we'll end there because I think the questions are trickling out. But again, just reach out to us. Michelle and Carolyn's email are on this screen right now, but you likely have an email from one of us in your inbox that you can quickly shoot over to us. So we'd be happy to follow up. And for those of you that are just starting out in the MVP process, we're really excited to have you on board. And for those of you considering it, we really strongly encourage you to do so. And we're here to provide any assistance you need as you think about that and get started.
Thank you, everyone. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.